Alright, so in this lesson we're doing the tank firing and the subsequent shockwave in the dust. Now the beautiful thing about this lesson is that we've already covered all of the main pillars that you need to set something like this up. So we did the dust on the ground with the starship going through the smoke, and as far as the shockwave, I'm just using the temperature push technique that we used for the nuclear shockwave for the bus. So if you've seen the previous lessons, it shouldn't be a problem for you to set something like this up, but I'm gonna of course walk you through it right now. So this is what it looks like from the top view. This was my scene. So the ground is completely covered with smoke, and then we have this second simulation of basically a burst of temperature, which is then gonna pick up the dust to go along with it, and it's just gonna create this beautiful shockwave effect. And then I also have a very subtle simulation of smoke on top of the tank body, so that as the tank fires, there's some dust that is picked up from the tank body. So there's just a little detail that we can add as well. So like I said, we've already covered the main pillars. So we have a grid, we have a source, we have our object. Nothing really new here, but I'm just gonna quickly show you how that's done. So as always, we would just make a grid, and then you could go under standard and create a box on the bottom of this grid. So maybe something like this. And again, object properties, make it not renderable, display as box, and then go right click, Phoenix FD properties, make it not a solid object. And I would create a regular Phoenix source and add this box as my source and set the emit mode to volume brush. And then you need to think about where you want the tank to fire. So for me, it happens on frame 5. So I would say on frame 5, I want the brush effect to be 100%. So I'm gonna set a key on frame 5 and then go to frame 0 and set it to 0% and make sure that it's 0, 0, 0. And then on frame 5, it's 100. We can set the temperature to 300, which would just make it neutral. So maybe let's make it 270 just so it sticks to the ground a bit more, and we can enable RGB and give it that dusty color. So maybe something along these lines. And I think that the grid is a bit too high, so I'm just gonna go under grid and lower that. So I'm just gonna click on my original to show you the grid settings. So for my final resolution, I did about 50 million total cells, but just when you're setting it up, something much lower would work. I'm doing jammed on -Z as always. Then you can go under dynamics, and I'm doing 0.2 for cooling to cool down the temperature. I'm doing 0.5 for smoke and large scale verticity, 0.5 for randomize amount. Conservation PCG with 80 for quality. You can even make this 100. This is really important here because you really want that shockwave to keep going, and you want the detail back here of that movement, so the conservation really helps with that. I did 3 steps per frame because it's a pretty fast push, and everything else is really standard. It's a bit hard to see, but we are actually mixing 2 different colors of smoke. We have the dust, and then the tank firing is more like a darker cloud. So you want to make sure that under output, you output RGB and velocity for motion blur as always. And under rendering volumetric options, you can play with the smoke opacity. So I did 0.4, and smoke color is based on the RGB. So far we have the ground dust set up, but we don't have the blast yet. So I'm gonna make actually another cylinder. And after playing around with this, I found that if you make sort of a wider cylinder, it's gonna get you a much bigger shockwave. So you could just make a tiny cylinder and make it fit into this hole, but you can sort of fake it and get a much cooler shockwave just by using something much larger. So I did something along these lines here. So something like this for the emitter for the blast. And as always, object properties, make it not renderable, display as box, Phoenix FD properties, make it not a solid object. And I would just, actually before I did that, you need to go make it an editable poly and select the front polygon, make it an ID 10 because we only want to emit the temperature out of the front. And then I would just create another source and add this cylinder as another source. As before, we want this blast to happen on frame 5. So I went to frame 5 and I'm gonna set auto key and set this outgoing velocity to 4,000 meters, set a key, and then it should be 0 on frame 4 and it should be 0 on frame 6. So only for that one frame it's at 4,000 meters outgoing velocity, and you can set the temperature to 2500. So really the hot temperature is what's gonna heat up this dust and make it rise up along with the blast. So the temperature is super important here to make it work. Everything else can stay at default, but we're gonna enable RGB and we want the blast to be maybe like a darker smoke color, so maybe a dark gray. And the polygon ID we're gonna set to 10. So at this point we have caught up to my original scene, so I'm just gonna delete this. Just wanted to show you how that's set up. And the only remaining thing is emitting some dust out of the tank body. It's kind of hard to see, but it is there. So for that I created a third source and I just clicked add and I added the entire tank body as an emitter. And basically on frame 5 again, I'm emitting just 0.1 outgoing velocity with 100 temperature, 0.1 for smoke, and a very light color for the RGB. And that'll just give me a little bit of smoke to emit on the body of the tank like this. So I just ran the simulation again right before I recorded the lesson to make sure that everything is working, and this is the result that I got. So this is exactly what is included in the project file under the video. So you can open that and look at the exact settings if you would like. Now, one more thing that I want to touch on is the shading for this blast. So as you can see, the blast actually ends up being this ball of light that illuminates the scene around it, and I really wanted that. So you would just go under the rendering settings for the fire. For the fireball itself, I'm rendering the fire based on temperature, meaning that the hottest temperature will be the brightest. Fire opacity is set to fully visible. I set the fire multiplier to 1, and everything else here is at default. I really just needed that fireball to show up, and pretty much the default settings will get you there. This is the last in the series of lessons that only cover smoke. In the next lesson, we're gonna start getting into fire, and that's where I'm gonna go over all of these settings in detail. But for now, all you really need to know is that if you set the fire based on temperature and the temperature is high enough, it should render as a fireball like this. And as far as the lighting and rendering, it's the exact same V-Ray Sun setup that I covered in the beginning. There is gonna be another lesson in this course just talking about rendering and optimizing your renders, making them faster. But I don't want to get into that just yet. And as far as the background, it's just these rocks from CG Trader. So if I unhide that, I just needed some kind of a background. Just so that it's not against the black background, and I think it really helps to make the shot look nicer. So definitely a cool little setup of having this shockwave happen. I hope that you guys found it helpful, and I'll see you in the next lesson.